This is going to be Chapter 19, Documentation. And after completion of this chapter, you'll be able to understand these concepts. The patient care report is an important medical, business, and legal document. The patient care report is a part of quality assurance and performance and improvement program. Different formats available for documentation that focuses on the precise reflection of the events that occurred. Special incidents such as disasters that require special reports. And the overall purpose of EMS documentation is sixfold. And one, it's a representation of the patient's medical care, part of the medical record, a quality assurance tool to be sure that things were done appropriately, a business record, a research document, especially if the patient's conditions were under research at that time, and a legal record. Figure 19.1, physicians using a pre-hospital care records to obtain information that might otherwise be unavailable, if you already had to go available and wasn't there. Figure 19.2, the pre-hospital patient care report is a legal document as well as a medical record. Elements of a PCR. PCR has many fields for data entry. Documentation standards. At a minimum, the paramedics should document the reason for the urgent transport of the patient to an emergency department, essentially a medical necessity. There's also something called a prudent layperson standard. Another person, not a physician, who was in the same or similar circumstances would think that it is appropriate to call EMS. Now, we don't always fit that category, but very simply, we do not have a full lab and the ability to draw blood work in the back of our ambulance as well. So, very simply, if it was an emergency to them, there's some legal ramifications there if we miss something during our assessment. Following a prescribed format, the paramedic should legibly write down his or her observations on the patient care record in black ink. Loss of information may cause harm, legibility is important, and slang and jargon are inappropriate. Errors or omissions. We should probably just draw a line through any kind of errors. Let's say that I was trying to write the word lung, L-N-G, and I missed the U in there. A good way to do that would be just to strike through it where it's still legible, initial it, and go on. There's several techniques for this. Strike out mistakes on the PCR with a single line or stricken out. Date and initial of the strikeout. The only thing I was missing here was the actual date. A line out in open areas prevents content from being added to, so at the end of your statement, I always like to put nothing follows. There should be only one author to a PCR, very simply. Some paramedics very simply sign out with time, date, and initial after the last entry. Indicates the PCR was written and completed by the person listed in charge at the time and date listed. Upon regarding entire passages or entries with substantial errors, should be crossed out with a single slash. Revision should then be written on another page or on a continuation form with cross-references made. Documentation standards, table 19.1, black ink is preferred. Legibility is way important, especially if you're writing things by hand. Slang and jargon is not used. Errors noted with a single strike through and initialed. Empty space is lined out. Sign out includes initials, date, and times, and one author for each record. Confidentiality. Fax machines or facsimile machines, the use may be acceptable with safeguards. Contact the receiver and advise them of the transmission. Recipient should respond with a verification receipt. If the PCR is inappropriately sent to the wrong address, a cover sheet should clearly indicate that the facsimile is confidential and ask that the receipt to destroy the copy. Current regulations under HIPAA may make the use of facsimile machines inadvisable in the future. And HIPAA essentially federal mandate for confidentiality unless it is directly related to the patient's care. We cannot give out any information. Figure 19.3, HIPAA regulations impact on record keeping, pretty much under lock and key. Forms of documentation. Now there's a couple different forms here. Electronic documentation from mobile data terminals or personal digital assistants is probably the way of the future, the way things mostly are going these days. On-scene medical records, mobile data terminals, secure satellite uplinks, and computer databases make obtaining patient medical records while on scene very possible. The American Society for Testing Materials Standard Guide for providing essential data needed in advanced pre-hospital emergency medical service includes requirements for secure access and authorized use in order to protect patient confidentiality. Forms of documentation continued here. Problem-oriented medical record keeping, used to track and manage patient records. Master problem list, a list of medical conditions in which the patient had been or currently was receiving treatment for. There's progress notes in there, new entries into the medical record, and the use of SOAP format, subjective information, objective information, assessment, and plan of action. EMS PCR formats. Minimum data sets required certain field completions. Now, things of this are going to be like response times and specific destinations and whatnot must be filled out by certain EMS PCR forms. Standardized data sets, tremendous research potential, which are essentially dot to dots. Using standardized data sets has tremendous research potential. Efficiency can be measured, and now that we have data sets and we have the ability to track this information. Close form documents, bubble forms. Circles next to the options, which the paramedic fills in, easily scanned. Restrictive, assumes that most patients will have the same or similar complaint, symptoms, and so on. May be used with combined forms. There's several ways of writing the actual documentation, and on the next slide we're going to talk about how I want you to write them at Redlands Community College. Early EMS documentation formats was chart and NAP, and I would like you all to do chart. So we're going to actually talk about chart here a little bit, quite a bit on the next page. But it's kind of a combination. Our version of chart is actually more along the lines of a cheated and chart format. So cheated is the chief concern, the history, what was done on initial examination, your objective assessment, the treatment with any kind of outcomes that would be positive or negative, evaluation of your treatment modalities, and a disposition of the patient is cheated. Now, I would like you to use chart, but still put that same information in there. So we're going to kind of go over this. So very simply, the C stands for complaint. And the H stands for history. So tell me what happened. Why were you called, or why was EMS called to that scene, and what their history of present illness is. Also, in the history of present illness, whenever you describe it out, please place in there as well on VisDap their weight. So patient is approximately kilograms. Whatever you put in that, whether that's obtained from a family member, significant other, or from the patient themselves, I'm going to hold you to that as the gospel. So whenever you're figuring drug dosings down below and you're administering those, I'm going to check it or QI it against the weight that you place in their history. Assessment. So complaint, history, assessment. I would like a BLS assessment first, airway, breathing, circulation, neuro, and this would be an AVPU. The secondary assessment starts off with the head. Head, ears, eyes, nose, throat. Anything that you needed to tell me about the head, ears, eyes, nose, and throat. Next thing I like to see is chest, back. After that, pelvis. Upper extremities, lower extremities, all in the assessment. And any kind of pertinent negatives or pertinent positives that you might have found about any of those areas at that point. And I forgot right here, abdomen. In the treatment, so we've talked about complaint, history, assessment, complete review of systems head to toe, and then your treatment. Your treatment, very simply, what you did in BLS mode, what you did in ALS mode, what was the outcome, good or bad, positive or negative, and any adjustment. And this would be the treatment. Transport, which is the T, so we went through all of these at this point. Tell me how the patient was transported. Tell me how many straps you had on them. If there was anything eventful that occurred during the transport, as far as an operational standpoint. I moved patient from point A to point B without any incident whatsoever. Times 5 straps. Report was given to RN such and such at whatever medical center, and patient was left in care of staff. Be sure and also have a signature, blah, 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 of your actual person receiving the report from you. Mnemonics. Table 19.2 OPQRST is a nice mnemonic to remember about pain. I would really like you to do ASPN, associated symptoms that might come along with this pain, and any kind of pertinent negatives added to this mnemonic. Onset, provokes, quality, radiation, severity, and time is what OPQRST stands for. Past medical history, that history of present illness. Please elaborate if they've had a stroke, seizure, heart attack, hypertension. Example of this, you get called for chest pain and the patient's had a previous heart attack and they got angioplasty for it. That needs to be in your history section of documentation. Standard review of systems, and this is what we did in the assessment, head, ears, eyes, nose, and throat, but should be neurological, cardiovascular, pulmonary, gastrointestinal, endocrine, genital urinary. Are you making any urine? I would do this in the pelvis section, and integument, which would be skin, and musculoskeletal. Special documentation. Refusal of medical assistance documentation. Be sure and protect yourself. If someone called 911 and then they did not want to go, be sure you elaborate on why they did not want to go. Also be sure that you gave the patient informed consent and that they signed and a non-biased person witnessed. Hazardous material operation documentation, same way. Need to very simply be explicit about what was on scene, If you can identify what measures were taken for safety in this operational austere condition. Documentation of multiple casualties, and most of the time we will do trauma triage tags for that. However, you may find yourself running 10 patients on normal run reports. So involve the operational supervisor at your service. Think about that. Is this a mass casualty, and can I use the trauma triage tags? If I use the trauma triage tags, most of the time services will still have you put the information back into the computer system, especially if they're running on ePCRs. Special documentation of pregnancy and childbirth. Be sure and document those things well. You can't just put on there, patient was pregnant. How are their contractions? How many children did they have? Last wellness visits, all in past medical history. Special incident reporting. Whenever we look at special incidents, we should look at things like child abuse, domestic violence, and elderly abuse. All of those will be special incident reporting and will require more paperwork. Legal proceedings. The paramedic may be called upon to provide special documentation if they witness a crime or named as a party in a negligence claim. Documents include an affidavit, a deposition, and a transcript. An affidavit is essentially a sworn statement about the events surrounding the incident. A deposition is a testimony of a witness in a setting outside of a court where attorneys from both parties can interrogate the witness. And a transcript is a word-for-word account. It's then produced for the use of the lawsuit and may be submitted into evidence in a court of law. In conclusion, documentation is an important aspect of EMS. Quality of patient care and the paramedic's professionalism is often reflected in the PCR. The beneficial nature of a PCR is a function of its ability to communicate the message the sender intended for the receiver. Paramedic can expect success with her documentation by learning correct medical terminology and abbreviations, reporting thoroughly but consistently while utilizing a charting format consistently. Whatever format that you pick now is the same format that you need to continuously use later. I've used the same format for many years. References for this chapter are from Richard Beebe, Professional Paramedic, Volume 1, Foundations of Paramedic Care, First Edition, pages 336 to 351 of Del Mar Learning. And if you have any questions concerning this chapter, feel free to give me a call. My name is Roy Smith, smith@msa.net, or 45219-7613. Thank you.